How y'all doing? Okay. I'm so excited to be here. I'm never intimidated by crowds that seem to be smaller because as a young child, I would sneak out to my parents' garage late at night, and I would preach in the garage to the crickets, to the grasshoppers, to the any animal that was out there in the garage that would listen to me. In fact, I grew up in the church. My father was a pastor in Charlotte, North Carolina, and growing up in the church, I can remember one Sunday where my mother was greasing my face, as she always does, because it was Youth Day Sunday, and I had the responsibility to read from the Old Testament. And I can remember as she was sitting there greasing my face, my father, her husband, at that time, she was greasing my face, telling me, Timothy, now don't go up here embarrassing us, don't stutter, don't be nervous about anything, you're going to do just fine, just get up there and just talk. And I got up there and I opened up the Old Testament and I turned to this book that we now call Psalms, but at that age, I was only 5 or 6 years old, and I announced to the church, if you would turn with me to the book of Possums, because I pronounced the word Psalms as possums, and so I've always had an interesting relationship with the book of Psalms. But family, I think that there's something to be said that a young child like me reads from the book of Psalms and calls it and mispronounces it because it shows that we don't really have a deep appreciation for the book of Psalms. In fact, today, because the thematic emphasis is worship the Lord, I want you to come with me to a psalm that we often don't lift up. I want you to come with me to Psalm 22:6. If you have your Bibles, if you have the time to go look on your media devices, nobody's moving right now, so I guess I'll just read it to you aloud. But I am a worm and not human. But I am a worm and not human. This text is interesting, beloved, because we have been given the thematic emphasis of worship the Lord. We have been given the responsibility to compose a sermon based off of the book of Psalms, the 150 Psalms, this book that we so love and that we always cherish, and we only lift up really in kind of the cliches of the book of Psalms. We only kind of study it and read those verses that make us feel good. Oh, you know what I'm talking about. I will bless the Lord at all times, and his praises shall be in my mouth continually. I read the book of Psalms, and you see in black churches and churches across America that we don't really delve into the book of Psalms. But the interesting fact of the matter is that the book of Psalms is not all about worship. The book of Psalms is not all about happiness. The book of Psalms is not all about joy. Sometimes the psalmist gets sad, and he practices this form that we call lamenting. Walter Brueggemann would suggest that the book of Psalms is made up of 33% of laments. That is, that the psalmist comes out and cries. The psalmist comes out and asks questions about to God and to God's characteristics, asking questions such as, God, how long will you hide from me? God, how long will you stand off from me? God, where are you at right now? God, why do you stand so far off from me? God, the book of Psalms is a psalms not of just happiness, but a psalms of lament. And family, I came today to lift up the idea that lamenting in some ways can actually get you closer to God than worshiping God, because you do realize that worship is not indicative of relationship. You do realize that just because you have a good shout, because you have a good holler, because you can say it, because you can speak it well, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a relationship with God. In fact, you can be the leader of the praise worship team and have the church up under the pews, but just because you have the church up under the pews is not indicative that you are anointed by God, that you are standing in your gift authentically. In fact, oftentimes we stand up and preach the gospel to impress people rather than to press people. We use worship as a form to kind of go out and just kind of use it as a survival apparatus, trying to put a praise on everything. But the fact of the matter is that we need some time to lament. If you're not too mean and nasty, just look to your neighbor and say, we need some time to lament. We need some time. Oh, please talk back to me if you can. But I was perplexed when I first read this psalm and really came across the ideal of lamenting, because theologically speaking, most of us in this room hold that God is omnipresent. And by omnipresent, we hold that God is everywhere. And by everywhere, we mean that God is in everything, is around us, is under us, is in us, is beneath us, that God is just everywhere. And I began to really ponder and to really think about that theological premise that God is omnipresent. and then thinking about the fact that we lament in the Psalms, that the psalmist laments on behalf of the nation, the psalmist laments on behalf of themselves. And I began to think to myself, well, if lamenting is supposed to be telling God about what's going on, and we believe that God is omnipresent, wouldn't that be kind of an oxymoron? If God is everywhere, and if God is in the room right now, God knows when your trouble shows up. You say that God is omniscient. You say that God is omnipresent. You say that God is omnipotent. And yet we sit up here and we summon God through laments. But the question really is that lamenting is really not for God, but lamenting is more so for us. Lamenting is the opportunity for us to emote our emotions that we have bottled up on the inside. And I come today to tell somebody and to bother somebody and to tell somebody on this day, on Thursday, that too often we have preachers who get up in the pulpit and are trying to preach a message that's going to push the crowd into a praise break that breaks nothing but sweat. And family, you got to understand that if you are not lamenting, if you don't actually take and divulge into what lamenting is, you have to appreciate the art of lamenting. And I just wanted to give you that spiel there because before I touch the text that I've selected today, Psalm 22:6, is about lamenting. The psalmist comes out and says, "But I am a worm." He didn't say, "But I am a lion." It does not say, "But I am an eagle." It does not say that I am a fox or a bear or some great animal we like to compare ourselves to. But it says explicitly, "But I am a worm." The question that I immediately have that pops into my mind, that comes to the front of my mind, is that this psalmist has felt othered somehow, that the psalmist feels different. The psalmist feels shamed. The psalmist feels shunned. And since we're at the Academy of Preachers and we're dealing with young preachers and we're in an age where there's so much pressure on us to save the church, one must ask the question, do we at times feel like worms? Are you a worm yourself? You're looking at me strange and funny and say, "Timothy, I don't know about you, but I'm not a worm. I'm not ooey and gooey like a worm." But really think about what a worm does. A worm is capable of going underneath ground. And when a worm goes underground, it deals and can take from the environment from above waste and excretes and all types of boo-boo and feces. I'm going to say it how y'all know how I'm talking. It has the ability to take this waste, the feces, the excretes out of the environment that it's living in, and it can literally turn it into nutrients for its soul. And that's something that I can relate and correlate to us as young preachers because we have to take waste, we have to take excretes, we have to take the boo-boo, the feces that we've been given as a generation and figure out a way to fashion it into nutrients for the soul. Is there anybody in here that can say, "I feel like a worm sometimes"? The worm experiences two conditions in life. It either gets stepped on or it gets stepped over. I've been stepped on and stepped over so many times in my life. When my father pulled me aside one day and in anger told me I would never be a good preacher, I would never be a good pastor, I felt stepped on. As young people, we can feel stepped on when we're trying to progress the church, trying to talk to the senior leadership of the church, trying to get them to understand that we need to progress the church, but they step on us and step over us time and time again. Is there anybody in here that can testify and say, "I felt like a worm"? I've had to lament like the psalmist. I've had to admit that I've had to cry some tears, sometimes trouble in my way. I had to cry sometimes. I lay awake at night, but that's all right because Jesus will fix it after a while. But the fact of the matter is that sometimes after a while don't come for the next 5 years. Sometimes after a while don't come for the next 10 years. Sometimes after a while don't come for the next 15 years. And family, I came today to tell somebody that I have had to lament, I've had to cry because so often I felt like a worm. Yeah. I felt like a worm. Family, and as I close out this sermon, I don't mean to preach too long. I don't believe in holding your attention. I don't believe in holding you for 10, 20, 15 minutes. I believe in preaching very quickly, getting to the point that the psalmist has lamented. The psalmist feels like a worm. We as young people feel like worms sometimes because we're not respected. But there's something deeper in the text. There's something much deeper in the text because if you were to go back and read the original Hebrew of the text, you would find that the psalmist comes out and says, but I am a worm and not human. That word worm translates from the Hebrew to the English as a crimson worm. When I first read this text, I thought it was talking about a worm that's in America, a worm that you would see at the bus stop or after the night it had rained. I thought you was talking about a worm that you just found somewhere in the mud as a child. But no, it was referring to the crimson worm. And if you knew what the crimson worm was, you would say that our generation has a lot in common with it. You would say that the crimson worm has to go through a process, that it gets pregnant one time in its life. It gets pregnant with its children, and it goes and attaches itself to a tree. And after it attaches itself to the tree and the worm begins to give birth, what happens to the worm is that the worm's body is torn apart by the children that it has birthed. And the blood from the crimson worm drops down on the children that it has birthed. And the blood from the crimson worm covers the worms that it's just birthed. And family, I've come today to ask you the question that you are a crimson worm. You are going to die for something. You are going to have to sacrifice for something. You're going to have to bleed for something. And it's our time now in 2018 to choose what we're going to bleed for. I feel like I'm bleeding all the time. It feels like when I go in church, I'm not respected. I feel like a worm. And if you feel all right, if you've had some times when you felt sad, if you've had some times when you've had to lament and cry to yourself all night long, why don't you turn to somebody, if you're not too mean and nasty, and say, neighbor, I felt like a worm. I felt stepped on. I felt stepped over. But oh Lord, I know that I am a crimson worm. And I don't know how you feel about it, y'all, but that crimson worm I'm referring to could be my mama. It could be Harriet Tubman. It could be Medgar Evers. It could be anybody from history. But in my tradition, we call that crimson worm Jesus, and his blood is on you. His blood is on your family. You're covered in your finances. You're covered in your church. Is there anybody in here that knows my Jesus? I feel all right because there's power in the name of Jesus. Power to make you cry when ain't nothing sad. Power to make you laugh when ain't nothing funny. Power is in that name. Is there anybody in here that feels like a worm? I'm just a worm. I'm a crimson worm. I've been bleeding. I've been suffering, but I'm just a worm. And so remember, family, that you're just a worm. You're going to have to sacrifice and die for something. But God will provide for you. God bless you.